In the heart of West Africa, a silence long soaked in fear was shattered in May of 2023. For years, the villages of Burkina Faso's center-west had lived beneath the shadow of terror. Marketplaces deserted, roads mined, families torn apart. Armed groups tied to Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State ruled not with flags, but with bombs, ambushes, and silence. But from the ashes of despair rose Operation Enupo. To clean, they called it. Not just the soil, not just the roads, but the soul of a nation tired of waiting, tired of dying. Behind this campaign stood a man not of palace speeches, but battlefield dust. President Ibrahim Traoré, once an artillery officer, now the unflinching face of defiance. And as thousands watched with hope and dread, his army and the civilian volunteers of the VDP launched one of the most daring operations Burkina Faso had ever seen. Do not just watch history happen, stand with it. Subscribe and walk with us through the courage, the fire, and the rise of Burkina Faso. Because this isn't just about bombs and bullets. It's about reclaiming dignity, one village at a time. By early 2023, Burkina Faso stood on a knife's edge. Entire swathes of land were under the grip of extremist groups. The once vibrant rhythms of village life had slowed to silence. Roads became death traps, laced with improvised explosive devices. Markets emptied, homes were abandoned, and children stopped going to school. Every morning began with uncertainty, and every night closed with prayers for survival. But in May, something shifted. On the 25th of May, the winds of change began to stir. The Burkina Faso Armed Forces launched Operation Enupo, meaning to clean in the Guruni language. But this was not about sweeping dust. It was about purging fear. The region in focus, center-west, long tormented by armed insurgents. The mission's objective: to liberate villages, dismantle terrorist strongholds, and restore civilian life. President Ibrahim Traoré, also referred to simply as Traoré by many locals, had made his position clear: no negotiations with terrorists. Having once worn the uniform himself, his words weren't mere rhetoric. Soldiers respected him not just as commander-in-chief, but as one who had marched with them, endured hunger and danger, and now led by example. Traoré's decision to mobilize the volunteers for the defense of the homeland, VDP, was bold. These were not trained warriors, they were farmers, traders, and teachers, but they had something more powerful than training: purpose. With rifles in their hands and their communities behind them, they stood shoulder to shoulder with the National Army. The operation was meticulously planned. Intelligence officers, local informants, and drone surveillance worked in tandem to create a real-time map of enemy positions. Villages like Boum, Kalabo, Zelise, Gosina, Nagarpulu, Koalio, Zamo, and areas surrounding Tonado were identified as major terrorist bases. These were not just dots on a map. They were nightmares for villagers. Places once known for weddings and harvest festivals had become training grounds for terror. Before a single soldier advanced, the sky came alive with the thunder of artillery. Precision shelling, guided by drone footage, struck key hideouts. The goal was not just destruction, it was disruption. Cut the enemy's communication, disable their mobility, rattle their confidence. Then came the boots on the ground. Soldiers advanced in tight formations. Roads were blocked off, houses searched, and compounds raided. Every step was calculated, every alley a potential ambush. In Boum, they discovered a network of makeshift shelters used to indoctrinate and train new recruits. In Kalabo, a warehouse stocked with rifles, explosives, and satellite phones was uncovered. In Zelise, a command center was dismantled, sending shockwaves through the enemy ranks. But the danger was ever present. The soldiers weren't just fighting armed men, they were battling ghosts beneath the soil. Improvised explosive devices, IEDs, lay hidden under sand, leaves, and even children's toys. These silent killers didn't fire back. They waited. And many of the troops had to become part engineer, part warrior, probing, crawling, inching forward so others could pass safely. By the close of the campaign, 5 major terrorist bases had been eliminated. 9 militants were neutralized, and countless others fled into the bush. But perhaps more importantly, soldiers dismantled IEDs along critical roads, restoring mobility to local communities. Farmers began returning to their fields. Children dared to laugh again. and mothers stepped out without checking over their shoulders. Vehicles used by insurgents were seized or destroyed. Camps were burned to ashes. Radios and supplies were captured, severing enemy lines of retreat and regrouping. And while the world may have measured success in numbers, the villagers measured it in footsteps, the simple ability to walk freely without fear. Operation Enupo wasn't just a military maneuver, it was a promise kept, but the battle was far from over. As Operation Enupo gained momentum, so did the danger. Clearing buildings and removing roadside bombs was only the beginning. What lay ahead were not just physical threats, but the unpredictable defiance of an enemy desperate to hold ground. In the village of Gosina, resistance came swiftly. Gunfire erupted from a fortified compound disguised as a grain storehouse. For a brief moment, the operation hung in uncertainty. Then, a young corporal, barely 24, took the lead. He signaled his unit and stormed the compound under a hail of bullets. The clash was intense but swift. The enemy was neutralized before the battle could spread to nearby homes. His actions saved lives, not just of fellow soldiers, but of elderly residents trapped just a few meters away. Elsewhere in Nagarpulu, the path ahead was known to be laden with IEDs. It would have been easier, safer to retreat and wait. But the soldiers made a different choice. They crawled, inch by inch, with metal detectors and sharpened focus. Every cleared meter was a step closer to reaching families still hiding in fear. It took them hours to move a single kilometer. But when they emerged, guiding villagers by hand, it was clear. This was not just war. It was rescue. These stories didn't make international headlines. No medals, no speeches, just the quiet nods of those whose lives were saved. And among the villagers, those moments became folklore. Retold by firelight, remembered in song, and etched into community pride. As the campaign continued, more discoveries revealed the scale of the insurgency. In Zamo, hidden under floorboards, soldiers uncovered maps detailing future attacks, including plans to bomb a local school. In Coalio, a small cave was found to house communication equipment powered by solar panels, proof of how deeply embedded and resourceful the enemy had become. Each discovery justified the urgency of the operation. Each step forward, though laced with risk, was a blow against chaos. The psychological impact was just as profound as the tactical wins. For the first time in months, villagers could walk to a well, send children to school, and reopen their market stalls. In Tenedo, farmers spoke of planting again. Not just crops, but hope. One elder said, "I no longer sleep with my sandals on. That's how I know peace is returning." The reactions from the population were visceral. Some fell to their knees as the army entered. Others offered food and shelter despite having barely enough for themselves. And many, especially women and children, clung to the uniforms of the soldiers, not out of fear but relief. Within the ranks, morale soared. The troops, though exhausted, were fueled by purpose. The VDP fighters, those volunteers from the towns, proved invaluable. They guided soldiers through secret village paths, translated local dialects during interrogations, and stood guard long after official patrols ended. Their commitment blurred the line between civilian and soldier, between home and front line. President Traoré, who followed the operation closely, made unannounced visits to nearby medical stations. When word spread that he had knelt beside a wounded conscript and whispered thanks, it reverberated like thunder through the ranks. "He eats our dust, he speaks our pain," one soldier said. This was not propaganda, it was personal. Leadership in Enupo wore boots. Meanwhile, media across Burkina Faso began to shift their tone. What began as cautious reporting turned into praise. Radio presenters called Enupo the turning of the tide. Citizens phoned in, pledging food for the troops, donations for displaced families, and most importantly, hope. The war-torn spirit of the nation was stirring. But all this light cast long shadows. The insurgents, though weakened, were not defeated. Many fled deeper into remote forest corridors, regrouping, changing tactics, and waiting for the next chance to strike. Enupo had changed the narrative, but the war was far from over. And in its wake lay the next battlefield, not in the fields, but in the homes, the markets, and the minds of a people trying to rebuild. As the dust of Operation Enupo began to settle, something more powerful than gunfire echoed through the valleys of Burkina Faso, the return of life. In places where silence had once signaled terror, new sounds emerged. The clang of market stalls reopening, the laughter of children running along once-abandoned roads, the chants of farmers blessing their soil. This was no ordinary aftermath. It was a fragile resurrection. Villagers who had fled during the height of insurgent control began returning. Entire families, mothers with infants, elders carried on makeshift carts, crossed rivers and fields to reclaim their homes. In Boom and Kalabo, farmers dug into the soil again, despite the scars it bore. For them, planting was more than livelihood. It was a declaration, we are still here. The reopening of local schools was perhaps the most symbolic. Teachers, many of whom had once been VDP fighters themselves, resumed lessons under mango trees and half-crumbled classrooms. Children no longer studied the geography of fear, but of their land, their people, their future. Security allowed markets to resume in Tenedo and Zelisay. Trade routes reconnected, bringing salt, oil, and cloth from neighboring regions. Women who had borne the brunt of displacement led the charge in rebuilding, organizing cooperatives, reviving savings groups, and holding community councils to account. Their leadership filled the governance gap left by years of chaos. The broader impact reached into the heart of governance. For years, Burkina Faso's counterterrorism had been reactive. Disjointed raids, erratic responses, and inconsistent protection. Enupo changed the paradigm. It demonstrated what could be achieved when strategy met resolve. No longer would the government be seen as absent. The state was back, not just in uniform, but in schools, clinics, and council meetings. President Traoré took a decisive step forward. He announced the expansion of rapid intervention battalions, the formal integration of VDPs into local defense protocols, and investment in rural security infrastructure. He proposed a controversial yet bold policy, special taxes to support defense funding, a 5% levy on mobile phone services, and a 10% surcharge on paid television. To some, it was a heavy burden. To others, it was a patriotic act. But for all, it signaled that Burkina Faso was no longer waiting for foreign donors to secure its dignity. Among the international diplomatic circles, there was confusion and curiosity. How could a small, underfunded nation pull off such a coordinated and effective campaign? The answer was simple: unity of purpose. This unity extended far beyond the battlefield. Faith leaders preached reconciliation. Youth groups cleared rubble. Even former civil servants, once silent during the turmoil, re-emerged to support local governance. The collective trauma began to find collective healing, yet danger lingered. Traffickers and recruiters, though weakened, still operated in border regions. Smugglers of weapons and radical ideologies tried to exploit the power vacuum left by retreating militants. And some remote villages still lived in silence, unsure whether safety was truly theirs again. But for many, Enupo served as proof, not just of military might, but of national capacity. It showed that Burkina Faso could rise from the ashes not as a victim of geopolitics, but as an author of its own future. Still, the question remained. If you believe this is what Africa needed all along, say Amen in the comments below. Because rebuilding is harder than destroying, and hope, once broken, takes courage to hold. But as Enupo showed, courage exists in every hand that dares to plant again. And yet, even as crops were sown and markets reopened, the question loomed. Could this fragile peace hold, or would old shadows return to reclaim the night? From afar, Operation Enupo drew mixed reactions. In Western newsrooms and policy briefings, the mission was either ignored or met with skepticism. Some analysts questioned its legality, others speculated about long-term consequences. But inside Burkina Faso, a different narrative took hold, one of self-determination. Unlike many past operations across the Sahel, which had leaned heavily on foreign aid, international advisors, or private military contractors, Enupo stood apart. It was powered by Burkinabe blood, sweat, and strategy. This shift was deliberate. President Ibrahim Traoré had made it clear, security must be homegrown. No more waiting on donor meetings in Geneva. No more decisions shaped in Paris or Washington. This doctrine of sovereignty unsettled some in the international community. After all, for decades, Africa's wars had often been seen through the lens of Western geopolitics, managed, contained, or stabilized from the outside. But Enupo rejected that script, and in doing so, it forced a reconsideration. Regional blocs like ECOWAS and the African Union expressed cautious support. While publicly applauding the restoration of order, they remained silent on the deeper implications. What if other nations followed suit? What if sovereignty, real sovereignty, became the new norm? In capitals like Brussels and Washington, silence was louder than applause. There were no press conferences celebrating Enupo's success. Instead, think tanks began quietly tracking the model, how intelligence, drones, and decentralized volunteer forces had combined to neutralize terror cells without outside command. What had once seemed impossible, a self-reliant African military achievement, was now unfolding in real time. The United States, while officially committed to counterterrorism in the region, refrained from commenting directly. Instead, their attention seemed focused elsewhere, perhaps uneasy with the optics of a former colony defying the old rules. Meanwhile, African thinkers and Pan-Africanists worldwide saw something else entirely, a blueprint. Social media channels lit up with praise. "We don't need foreign boots, we need local roots," one commentator said. Hashtags like Burkina Rising and Africa Can Defend Itself trended across the diaspora. Even in academic circles, Enupo was dissected, not as a military event, but a political turning point. Could this become the model for stabilization in Mali, Niger, or even parts of Nigeria? Could this signal a broader decolonization of defense? The world was watching, some with admiration, others with anxiety, and the deeper question remained, would they support this new path or try to steer it back to the familiar? Because Enupo wasn't just a campaign, it was a statement, and the world had no choice now but to listen. Operation Enupo may be over, but the battle for Burkina Faso's future has only just begun. What comes next will determine whether this moment of unity and defiance becomes a lasting transformation or a forgotten footnote in a long struggle. The operation proved one thing clearly. When Africans defend their land with African tools and leadership, success is possible. But to secure this success long-term, Burkina Faso must look beyond bullets. Institution building must follow battlefield victories. Local governance must be strengthened so that villages no longer wait for soldiers to feel safe. Education must be prioritized so that youth, once courted by radicals, instead build futures rooted in purpose. And health services, particularly in post-conflict zones like Center-West, must be restored, not as charity but as dignity. Other African nations watched Enupo closely. From Mali to Chad, whispers of replication grew. What if we trained our own VDPs? What if our presidents led from the trenches, like Traoré? The very idea that sovereignty could be real and not symbolic was intoxicating. This, more than any foreign policy doctrine, became the fire under a new continental vision. For President Traoré, this meant walking a tightrope. He must balance momentum with caution, national pride with pragmatic diplomacy. Too much haste could isolate Burkina Faso. Too little resolve could undo everything Enupo has built. The stakes are high, not just for his nation, but for how the world views African self-leadership. Economic opportunity must rise alongside security. Rebuilding rural economies, creating jobs for returning youth, and incentivizing investment in liberated zones will be key. Enupo swept the dust, but what seeds will be planted in its wake? And then there's the people, the real heartbeat of this movement. Their role cannot fade now. Civil society must hold leaders accountable, but also be empowered to take part in shaping the peace. Because in this new Burkina Faso, power must not return only to the palace, it must rest with the people who bled for it. This is no longer just about counterterrorism. It's about counterhistory, about undoing the myth that Africa cannot rise without foreign hands. And so, as the sun sets over villages once held hostage, a new dawn demands new answers. Will the continent embrace this model? Will the people rise as one? Or will fear once again be allowed to reclaim what courage has earned? Because in the end, the future will not wait. In the story of Burkina Faso, Operation Enupo will not be remembered merely for the ground it reclaimed, but for the spirit it reignited. It was more than a military maneuver. It was a statement, etched into the soil, spoken in the dialect of resistance. We are no longer waiting. From the broken roads of Zelensay to the scarred markets of Tenedo, the people proved that dignity can bloom even in the aftermath of terror. They did not beg for saviors. They stood side by side with their own, farmers as fighters, teachers as tacticians, mothers as messengers of strength. President Ibrahim Traoré, once a soldier, now a symbol, embodied a new era of leadership, not defined by titles, but by tracks left in the dust beside his people. He did not lead from balconies, but from the battlefield. And through his resolve, the nation remembered something ancient, yet urgent. Freedom is not granted, it is claimed. This is the Burkina Faso the world did not expect. But it is the Burkina Faso news that deserves to be told. A nation that rose with no spotlight. A people who fought with no guarantee. And yet together they shaped history. For those who still wonder if Africa can chart its own path, look no further than the fields of Center West. For those who ask what becomes of a people who've tasted their power, listen to the silence where gunfire once rang. This is not the end. It is a beginning. If this story moved you, then make your voice count. Like, share, and subscribe. Because dignity must never be silent again, especially not in Africa. And in the comments, remind the world of what is rising. Africa rise. Burkina Faso stands tall. Ibrahim Traoré news is no longer a headline. It is a legacy.